Chapter 26. Jake could scent out where each member of the local pack had marked his or her territory, the crosshatch of shifters who owned this mountain each in their own right. He knew he was trampling across it all and that they'd be super pissed when they discovered it, but the best way for him to draw the hunters' attention was by making an obvious loner of himself. Like all predators, even human hunters will go for the weakest of the pack. So Jake tracked himself along their lines, making his marks and tracks stand out to look like he was a Omega Pack member or a lame one, someone they'd have left behind. Now Jake would turn that to his advantage and give them a target. They couldn't resist. He couldn't help thinking about Amanda as he went. He'd hated to leave her behind with Glenwood, but they didn't have a choice. He'd considered calling Captain Martin, but that would have just added more humans to the mix, more people who didn't understand, more people who might then find out the truth about his kind. Alistair would not thank him for that, even if those people could be made to understand. But the rest of Prowler's Bluff was not like Amanda, and Jake knew it was a risk he couldn't take, not even to keep Amanda safe. She'd wanted to do this. He wanted to believe she could. He looked up at the sky and saw, through the tree branches, that the sun had started to set. He hauled in a breath and shucked off his pants, summoning the wolf into his heart and body, and bent to put his hands to the earth as he began to change. And then Jake took a back seat and the gigantic black wolf went charging through the woods of the mountain, leaving a trail in its wake for the hunters to follow to their doom. Chapter 27. Amanda and Tom didn't make it to the hunter's cabin until 20 minutes before the sun would set completely and plunge the mountain into perfect darkness. It was even further up the mountain than Jacobson's, a full hour and a half's walk further to be exact. The altitude was such that she found herself huffing and puffing as they walked. Tom did too, though. He wasn't any more accustomed to the thinner atmosphere than she was, and that was some consolation. It meant maybe the other hunters weren't either, and that might give Jake the advantage. The cabin itself was much nicer than she expected. Amanda had figured it would look something like Fred Jacobson's outpost, just a bunch of disjointed shelters latched together. But it was basically someone's vacation house. It was big and well lit, easy to spot as they tromped up the path towards it, the only electric light on the mountain for miles. Amanda was frankly surprised that they hadn't had a road paved in to get to it more easily, but then she saw all the ATVs parked outside, a row of 5 of them, and she realized a road would have drawn too much attention. These guys, whoever they were, wherever they were from, had been very good about not drawing too much attention. She shouldered her rifle as they got to the brick walkway in front of the house's well-lit front door. It felt like going to a damn dinner party, except that she was carrying a rifle that they would all expect her to use to shoot her boyfriend. Wait, no. Jake wasn't her boyfriend. Not yet anyway. She shook her head, trying to clear it, and then the door opened. The man who opened the door was tall and bald, built like a brick shithouse, but with a wide, toothy grin. "Tom, you made it." "Said I would," Tom muttered squirrely. Amanda bit down on a sigh and offered the bald guy a charming smile. Amanda. "My niece," Tom managed to add. "Amanda, this is Rufus. My hunting buddy." "So excellent to meet you," she said. Rufus nodded, but Amanda could tell when he looked from her to the rifle in her hand that he was skeptical. "Tom's niece," he said. "Well, come on in." "Amanda. Tom. We're just having a few drinks before we head out. You don't mind night hunting sugar, do you?" "Not at all," Amanda said. "It's not what I'm used to, but I like to try new things. Honestly, my uncle here's taken me pretty much all kinds of hunting, and I'm getting kind of bored with it. He said you guys did some really awesome stuff." "Did he?" Rufus eyeballed Tom as Amanda passed him and walked into the house. She managed not to look over her shoulder at them, but only because she was struck by the house itself and its interior decorating, if it could even be called that. There were trophies everywhere, hunting trophies. Amanda had never been one to shy away from the sight of mounted heads, but every inch of the corridor that led into the living room was decorated with dead eyes that watched her as she passed. Bucks, bears, ducks, wolves, woodland animals of any and all species, hanging dead and empty on the walls. Amanda was revolted by it. She'd never really thought much about the practice before, since Captain Martin had a buck above his fireplace that he was particularly proud of. But when she pictured people with their heads stuffed and mounted on those walls, she understood the rage that consumed Jake's heart. Whenever he'd looked at Tom Glenwood. In the living room, 3 other men were relaxing on black leather sofas, sucking on bottled beer, all in dark shades of camouflage head to toe. They looked very much like they were going to do something illegal. "Ted, Jimmy, Bub," Rufus said, waving towards Amanda and Tom as they entered. "This is Tom's niece, Amanda. She's bored with regular hunting and wants to join us tonight." Amanda smiled to these assholes. "If you don't mind, obviously." She gave her rifle a pat, and the 3 hunters all smiled back at her, toothy and wide and slightly drunk. "More the merrier," Bub barked. "We got bored with regular hunting too," Ted practically leered at her. "Beer." Jimmy offered one and Amanda nodded and took it, turning it to pop the cap off. Using the butt of her rifle like a pro, an appreciative noise moved around the room as the hunters watched her do it, and she let the cap clatter across the floor as she lifted the beer to them in cheers. "Thanks, guys." She drank, but her eyes watched the lot of them, noting how they paused to watch her before lifting their own beers. She didn't think Tom had betrayed her, but these guys didn't trust her either. And she could tell it. They were going to watch her like a hawk, and she had to be careful to be good enough to gain their respect without being so good that it was obvious she knew what they were doing. It was a dangerous line to walk, but she thought about Jake out in the woods pretending to be the bait, and knew she had to get it right. If anything happened to him because of this ludicrous plan, she'd never forgive herself. They were so close to happiness. Amanda drank her beer with the hunters, listening to them talk. Rufus owned the house but lived primarily in Montana. Ted and Tom both did a lot of traveling, never together, but Ted had a home in Chicago and Amanda thought he must have been the hunter Jake had been trying to catch this whole time. Bub was from Texas and had a powerful drawl to his speech as a result, and Amanda noticed he wore a belt buckle with bullhorns etched into silver. Not an accessory that she was likely to forget, it was so big. Bub was also wearing cowboy boots, which Amanda thought were not particularly practical on a mountain, but there was no accounting for idiocy. The rest were in tightly laced combat boots, much like Amanda herself. She thought they must have had much more experience hunting in the area. All these things she was filing away when Rufus announced that it was time to head out. Amanda glanced at the window and saw that the sun had set. The view from the house was just a blanket of black sky and shadowy trees. The hunters finished up their beers and Amanda did the same. It left her flushed, drinking so quickly, but she drank beer often enough that she wasn't even really buzzed. Rufus led them through to the back of the house where a mudroom opened up to a back porch with steps right down onto the mountain. There the hunters armed. Each of them shouldered their rifles and pocketed extra ammunition, packing rounds into their hunting vests. Tom handed Amanda some extra ammo as well, which she fit into her jacket pockets, but then Rufus opened a black plastic case to reveal the night vision headsets. "Looks like we don't have one for you, sugar," he told Amanda, flashing her a smile that was not at all apologetic. "You'll just have to stick close to us." Amanda's stomach dropped towards her shoes. How was she supposed to keep a lookout for Jake if she couldn't see in the dark like the rest of them? "Don't worry," Tom told her, giving her shoulder a pat. "Nothing to be afraid of out there. You think you like it? I'll get you a pair for Christmas." Amanda cleared her throat and shot Tom a tight smile. "Really? I'd like that." "No use spending the money on a fancy piece of equipment you'll never use," Tom said. "Ain't that the truth?" Rufus chuckled as he headed for the porch door. "Got my sister's kid a pink handgun for her birthday last year. Lives in a lockbox in their closet now, and it's never gonna see the light of day." "Pink?" Bub laughed. "It's really pink?" "Pepto pink," Rufus confirmed, nodding. "How old is this kid?" Tom asked. 8. Rufus passed him one of the headsets, then doled out the rest. Amanda watched the hunters settle them onto their heads, lowering the eyesights to their eyes. The porch outside was completely dark. There wasn't a man-made light for miles, and the moon itself would be obscured by foliage once they tromped into the woods. Amanda was going to be more or less blind beyond a few feet in any direction, and her enemies would have perfect vision. She gripped her rifle and tried to look like the anticipation of the hunt was making her jumpy, not the nerves she was really feeling, not the fear that was creeping into her heart. For Chapter 28. Jake found the hunter's cabin easy enough. He knew from Tom's directions more or less where it was, and once he'd shifted into his wolf form it was easier to track the human sense that led right to it. When they left the house and emerged onto the porch, Jake could smell Amanda in the air. Her scent was more or less imprinted on him for life, he thought. He'd never confuse her for someone else, never lose track of her if he could catch her scent on the breeze. And even through the beer and gunpowder and the smell of death coming off that house in nauseating waves, Jake knew she was there. He kept a fair distance back from the house, but his wolf eyes could see the hunters as they paraded down the steps and into the woods. His wolf ears could hear their tromping footsteps as they cut a path through the brush. He could see that they were wearing the night vision headsets, and that Amanda didn't have one. That was problematic, but he could see them and that would be enough. He just had to be sure Amanda didn't accidentally shoot him. Probably. She was just as worried about that possibility, and she'd be extra careful, but Jake knew that it couldn't have been comfortable for her being more or less blind and surrounded by these dickholes. Once they'd started off, Jake crept through the shadows after them. He'd left plenty of marks, an abundance of traces. If it worked, they would see them soon enough and start following the path he'd built for them. It would lead them not exactly in a circle, but on a twisting path to a ravine that would serve as a perfect ambush spot. Jake and Amanda would be able to guard their backs while cornering the hunters against a 50-foot drop, making them hand over their weapons and get on their knees. Jake knew he'd have to step back and let Amanda take over then, or else he would rip out their throats before he could stop himself. As Jake followed their trail, he picked up a few more things. Amanda was in the rear, likely following Tom because she couldn't see. Her step was heavier on the left, and Jake figured she had a secondary firearm strapped to her ankle. Smart. He could smell that the one in front was biggest, that he was carrying the biggest gun, and that he had the strongest smell of beer about him. Best to keep the others between that one and himself. The beer would make the guy brave and the gun would make him dangerous. The wolf just wanted to hunt. The wolf had these bastards in its nose and wanted a taste of their flesh, their blood. The wolf wanted to run them down and rip them to pieces, but Jake had to keep control of those impulses for Amanda's sake, even more than for his own sake. So he followed along behind them, trying to keep the wolf from getting too close, and felt some satisfaction when one of them called out an indicator he'd left a piece of his trail, and the rest of them turned to follow it right on schedule. The wolf in him wanted to howl in delight. Jake had to resist that impulse too. The hunters turned again at one of the tracks he'd left, and were heading towards the ravine. With victory singing through his bones, Jake let himself get much, much closer to them, hustling through the bushes and in between the trees until he could see Amanda's back directly ahead. That was when they sprang the trap. Chapter 29. Amanda couldn't see the tracks that the hunters were following. She had to assume that they were subtle enough and that Jake knew what he was doing, that they didn't give away their game. She had to stay close to Tom's back because as soon as he got a few feet away, she lost sight of him. But she could hear them. She heard Rufus turn fully about, facing them instead of leading them, and instinct saw her scrambling back and to one side even as she heard the ear-blowing cow of the rifle going off. She tripped over exposed roots and hit the ground, rolling, and then she heard the heavy thud of another body nearby. She turned on her hands and knees and could barely make out Tom beside her, but she could see the outline of him start to twitch and hear him gurgle his last breaths. Then she heard them moving all around her, surrounding her. One of them reached in and yanked the rifle right out of her hands. "Think we're that stupid, do you?" Rufus barked. "Well, we're not. We got eyes and ears everywhere, cop bitch. And we knew what you were the second you walked into our house. This whole mountain is my house, you hear me?" "Who?" Amanda asked. "Who told you?" "I don't feel like sharing that info with you, darlin'. It's just a shame. Because I thought, oh well, Tom was one of us. Guess I was wrong." "So you killed him?" "Shame," Rufus sighed. "I like Tom. But you know what success is built on? Trust. Trust and fear in this game. And Tom had too much fear and not enough trust. He should have come to me and trusted that I'd protect him." "Clearly, because you did a bang-up job of it," Amanda muttered. She slowly reached for Tom's head, trying to be subtle about it, grasping for the night vision headset strapped to his skull. "I don't expect you to understand," Rufus said. "You're a woman. Oh fuck you asshole, Amanda snapped. She got her fingers on the night vision goggles and then went still, a breath catching in her throat when she felt the end of a rifle tapping lightly against her chin. Let go of those, he said. You're not gonna need them. Coward, she spat. Won't even kill me while I can look into your ugly face? Call me all the names you like, Rufus laughed. But in a few minutes you'll be dead and we'll still be on the hunt. Whatever you set loose in these woods for us to catch, I'm gonna take particular joy in ripping its fluffy coat off and hanging it in my basement. So then you don't know everything, Amanda said. Rufus paused. She heard the other hunters around her shuffle their feet, suddenly nervous. Whatever information they did have, they thought it was solid. And it was solid, but it was incomplete. If you're going to tell me your partner is hiding out up here somewhere, waiting, then you can save your breath, Rufus said. I have it on good authority that he wandered into the woods and never came back out again. I bet he did, Amanda whispered. You fucking moron. The rifle's muzzle shoved painfully into Amanda's throat. What aren't you telling us? Get real. Rufus, we should go, Bub drawled. Just shoot her and let's get out of here. We can come back in the morning and get rid of the bodies, or just let the birds get to 'em. No, I want to know what she's not saying, Rufus snapped. I'm saying whoever your eyes are wasn't looking hard enough, Amanda hissed. And you're all going to regret it. You're even going to regret killing Tom, along with all the other people you've murdered for your own sick sport. Not sport, Rufus said. Well, some sport, Ted muttered. Also cash, Bub added. Pelts go for a pretty penny. Not yours, of course, Rufus said. Killing you is just for security. Like killing Tommy there was for security. I was inclined to make it quick for your sake sugar, since you're so pretty and I like to think just doing your job. But if you don't tell me what I want to know, I'm going to take you in the basement and peel your skin off to see if it'll get you talking a little easier. Amanda's hand started to shake, but she kept as much of a grip on Tom's headset as she could and kept her eyes wide open in the hopes that they would adjust enough to the darkness of the woods that she could make out anything helpful around her. But so far all she could really make out were the hunters' shoes, the end of Rufus' rifle, and Tom's dead body. The rest was just shadow and branches, and her hearing wasn't good enough to distinguish the sounds all around them. Wind against leaves, the heavy breathing of the hunters, bugs crawling and creatures shifting in the darkness. She prayed, begged, pleaded with the universe that Jake was nearby, that he knew what was happening. Surely he'd heard the gunshot. He must have been on his way. He wouldn't let her die here. She heard the low guttural sound of a wolf's growl and her heart skipped a beat. The hunters must have heard it too, because suddenly the end of Rufus' rifle left her throat. Amanda didn't wait for it to start. She grabbed the night vision headset and shoved herself to her feet, sprinting away from the knot of hunters. And she heard it at her back. She heard the growl turn into a furious howl, and heard the weight of a huge beast slamming into at least one of the hunters, a domino effect of bodies hitting the ground. Screams and snarls and gunshots cracked through the air, echoing against the mountaintops, bouncing against the trees. Amanda tripped several more times as she ran. She tried to figure out where the house was and if she was going in the right direction. She kept clipping tree branches as she went, stumbling over roots and rocks and just the wild landscape of the ground beneath her feet. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and her mind was racing with possibilities. Eventually she stopped running. Out of breath and at a loss, she stopped running. Even if she made it to the house, she was going to go back. There was no point fighting it. She was going to go back for Jake. She lifted the night vision headset and settled it onto her head, hooking it over her hair and bringing the sights down over her eyes. She switched it on, and the whole world lit up in shades of gray and green, trees and rocks, and the sky finally illuminated. In the distance she could see the house, but she turned around and gasped when she saw the fight. Jake had taken out one of the other hunters, but Amanda couldn't make out who. She could only see that now there were two bodies on the ground instead of one. The rest was a blur of movement, the huge wolf in the middle and the remaining two hunters struggling either to get their rifles up and take aim, or to actually hit him. The guns were still firing, and she had to look away. Every time the muzzle lit up, even that brief spark of light was blinding with the night vision goggles. And if it was blinding for her, it was for them too, which explained why they kept missing. If they took off the goggles to aim, they'd lose sight of him. But if they kept them on to shoot, they had to close their eyes. Jake was dashing around them in circles, always moving, which made him difficult to hit. Amanda bent down and pulled the gun from her ankle holster and took the safety off, then ran back down the path she'd carved between herself and the fight. She came skidding to a stop, digging her heels in, and swung the barrel of her sidearm back and forth between the two hunters who were both whirling around and around trying to lock onto the gigantic black wolf. "Freeze!" Amanda shouted, hands in the air. One of the hunters whirled towards her, rifle coming up, and fired. Amanda ducked. She could feel the heat of the shot going wide but still too close for comfort. The wolf barked, and one of the hunters turned towards him and fired. To her utter horror, the wolf yelped in pain and saw it skittered back. There was a limp to its movements, and she knew he'd been hit. "Jake!" she screamed, eyes scanning the tree line and the green shadows, cloying there trying to find a sign of him. He couldn't be dead. He couldn't. He had to be alive. "Direct hit," she heard one of the hunters shout. "Good eye, bub." It was Rufus. "One down, one to go. Here, Wolfie, Wolfie. Here, lil police lady. Come to daddy." Amanda turned and lifted her gun. She had to stop them. She wanted to find Jake, but if they got away this time, she doubted she'd be able to find them again. Then she'd turn into Jake, hunting them across state lines, tracking them for years, only catching the ghosts of the dead they left behind. No, it had to end here. It had to end in Prowler's Bluff. But her peripheral vision was cut off by the night vision goggles. Bub turned to face her and put up his hands, his rifle held away from him. The flash of his belt buckle in moonlight made Amanda look away long enough for Rufus to slam the butt of his rifle to the back of her head. The ground rose up and smacked right into her, conking her forehead with dirt and leaves, the headset falling from her hair. Amanda was plunged into full darkness, pain spiking all through her body. As she groped at the dirt and struggled to stay conscious, all she could manage was a choked, whispered, "Jake." There was nothing but Chapter 30. Jake could only feel rage and pain. The wolf inside him fought for dominance, wanted to rend and shred and tear, to keep fighting, but Jake knew he wasn't strong enough and that one of the hunters had managed to shoot him. He wrestled the wolf down and tried to get low, to scurry between the trees for cover as he heard the other shots thundering through the wood. Then the rage began to fade, and in its place the pain grew and grew, until it overwhelmed his senses completely. There was nothing else for him at all except pain and dark in pain, the whole world reduced to these two things. And then he passed out from it. He came awake sometime later, aware that the wolf in him was dormant, quiet, or asleep in the back of his mind, licking its wounds or spent of its rage. He wasn't sure. Just quiet. And then he realized the earth beneath him was moving. No, he was moving across it. Leaves and twigs and dirt scraped along his naked back. He was in his man's skin, and someone was dragging him by the foot through the forest. He jerked awake, growling and flailing, ready to fight, and the person dropped his foot altogether and whipped around. "Steady on," the man snapped. "It's me." Jake struggled to lift his head, squinting through the pitch dark of the night wood until he could just barely make out the halo of wiry gray hair. "Fred." "That's right. What are you doing here?" "Well, dragging your ass off the mountain, looks like." Jake tried to sit up some more, but a stroke of pain tore through his abdomen, and he hissed and collapsed back on the ground. He heard shuffling through the leaves that papered the floor of the forest, and then Fred Jacobson was getting his hands under his arms, helping him towards his feet, and he went, despite the pain burning through him. "They shot me," he grit out, "and took Amanda." "I caught the scent," Fred said, nodding. Once Jake found his feet, Fred shouldered up his arm and started helping him to walk. "Think they took her back the way they come. But you need patching up, and I can't take on a whole house of hunters on my own. So we'll get you back to the outpost first." Jake was surprised to find that Fred was carrying most of his weight as they walked. It was slow progress, and he wanted to move faster, but every time he tried, the pain overwhelmed him, and he had to stop a moment and breathe through. Not for the first time, Jake found himself wondering just what Fred Jacobson was made of, but it seemed too rude to ask while the man was basically carrying him naked through the woods in the middle of the night. But it was either wonder about that or wonder about Amanda, and he couldn't think about what those hunters might have been doing to her then. He knew it would just send him into a blind rage and the wolf would wake, and if he went after her, now the hunters would kill him for sure. He'd been trying so hard not to kill them for Amanda's sake, and because he wanted to bring them to justice, and that had cost him. The odds were too stacked against him when he went at them alone and while trying not to kill. He knew he hadn't had much of a choice, but it still felt like his fault that now Amanda was with them and he was too fucked up to go save her. By the time they got to Fred's outpost, night was waning towards morning, and Jake could make out the hazy outline of pale clouds beyond the canopy of trees. Overhead, Jake was barely conscious, and Fred had long since just hauled him up into his arms to fully carry him, so he was dimly aware as they passed from the forest into the outpost. He could smell the herbs and the gunpowder, the thick scent of other that he knew was Fred himself. He saw the aisles of weapons and hunting gear pass by his head as Fred carried him to the back of the little shop and doled him with a huff onto the glass counter there. Then, aware that Fred was pulling a first aid kit from a shelf beneath the register, Jake passed out again. When he came around the next time, he recognized the outpost ceiling above his head. Hanging lamps were glowing softly, though he caught a sliver of morning light sneaking in through a crack in one of the blinds covering the nearest window. He felt numb from the neck down but found that if he exerted extraordinary effort, he could move the fingers of one hand. With a groan he tried to lift his head and couldn't. Fred appeared above him, wiping his hands on a bloody towel. "Patched you up," he said. "I can't move," Jake growled. "That's the anesthetic," Fred explained, nodding. "Had to numb you so you didn't punch me in the face while I worked." "Windlet wear off?" Fred checked his watch. "Should already be starting to go. Give it another half hour, you'll be on your feet again." "How bad?" "Not so." Fred shrugged. "Bullet went clean through. You're a lucky son of a bitch. Even the best hunters can't shoot with good aim in the dark. You got strong shifter blood, son. Wouldn't be surprised if you're completely healed in a week or two." "I need to be healed now." Fred shook his head. "Look now, it's too soon even for you. You're wounded." "Cleaned it up and stitched it shut, but that's not magic, Jake." "They'll kill her, Fred." "Probably, but they'll kill you too if you go charging in there. It's morning now. They'll see you coming for miles, and they know they probably didn't kill you last night, which means they got some choices. Either they'll come out today trying to run you down, or they'll wait because now they know they got something you want. And you, son, are number one on their hit list now. Shifter they know's gonna come right to them. And you're wounded." Jake grit his teeth, but he knew that everything Fred was saying was true. He was no match in this state for a house full of hunters, and especially if he wanted to get Amanda out safely. He needed help, and it couldn't just be Fred. Whatever he was, even two shifters would be hard-pressed to fight through those guns. And the house, Jake knew, must have been well fortified. And if it wasn't before, now that they had Amanda, it was surely by now. They'd had what was left of the night to figure out what they wanted to do, and Jake knew that. Fred was spot on. He was a pelt that was going to walk right up to their door. He had to find a way to overpower them. He needed more help, and he couldn't go to Captain Martin. They knew for sure now that the hunters had help inside the town, and Jake had to think that help was coming from right inside the station. Who else knew that he and Amanda were going to do this? Only Captain Martin. So if it wasn't him, it was somebody close to him. That avenue was firmly shut to Jake, and he had to leave it so. "Gimme painkillers," he told Fred. The outpost owner sighed and nodded, digging around beneath the glass counter. "Just a sec, let me see what I got." Jake started to feel a tingling through his body, and he found when he dug his elbows into the counter he could leverage himself up. He grimaced, looking down at the bandage wrapped around his abdomen, and the blood seeping to the surface of the material already, but he didn't stop. Fred had gotten some pants on him, it appeared, a brand new pair of camo fatigues that must have come right off one of the store racks. Fred just grunted his disapproval as Jake grabbed the cash register and used it to pull himself to an upright seat, swinging his legs over the counter. He felt feverish and chill from the exertion, but he ignored it in favor of watching Fred rummage through the first aid kit. The outpost owner came up with a handful of pill bottles and lifted them to one of the hanging lamps to read the labels. He selected one and tumbled 2 pills into the palm of his hand, then held them out to Jake. "What is it?" Jake asked even as he took the pills. Can't pronounce it, Fred muttered. But the other two kinds'll make you sleepy, so I figured you'd want the one labeled non-drowsy. Not that I don't think you should be sleeping, or even just resting, but I bet even if I did give you the knockout pills you just go crawling off to get yourself killed. Anyway, probably. Jake slapped the pills right into his mouth and swallowed them. Without water. But I'll take this opportunity again to say that you shouldn't go back to that house. I'm not going back there yet. Fred frowned. Then just what are you planning to do? Go to Prowler's Bluff and get backup. Jake shook his head. Prowler's Bluff isn't an option. Well, I'll go with you, but not like this, Fred said. Not half-cocked and fucked up like this. Your lady partner is a nice person doing what she did for shifters and standing up and all, but I won't go crawling up there just to get myself killed too. I wasn't going to ask you to do that, Fred. No, and you didn't have to. Want help saving her? I'll help, but not like a damn fool. I'll only help once you got yourself a reasonable plan. I have a plan, Jake said, and looked at the older trader. But I don't know that you'd call it reasonable. Fred's frown only deepened. I'm not gonna like the sound of this, am I? No, sir. Well, out with it then, you pain in my ass. Jake was quiet for a minute. He knew that once he said it, it would be out in the world and he wouldn't be able to take it back. He wouldn't let himself. And neither would the wolf. So he took that minute to really think about it. To come to terms with what it would mean if his plan succeeded and what it would mean if his plan failed. He thought of Amanda most of all. How close they'd come to actually having something. It had been close, hadn't it? He'd been able to reach out and touch it, to hold it in his hand for the first time. In so long that he couldn't remember another. He told her he loved her for fuck's sake, and then he'd let this happen. He was supposed to be the one protecting her. Now, even if it meant sacrificing his chance to be with her, he had to save her. That was the only true thing that Jake knew. No matter what else happened, he had to know that Amanda was alive and safe. That meant he'd give up everything and risk everything to make it happen. He would face his greatest fear and his greatest failure to do it. He winced, shifting a little in his seat as he wrapped his arm around his bandage midsection. He could feel the painkillers doing their work, soothing the worst of the ache at the edges of his mind and body, numbing his nerves to the pain. He thought another few doses might trick his body into thinking everything was fine, at least for a little while. That was all the time he was going to need. He finally looked at Fred. I'm going to fight Alistair for control of the pack, and then lead them to the hunting lodge and get Amanda back. Fred stared back at him, speechless. Chapter 31. Amanda burst back to consciousness when the pain between her temples roared so loud she couldn't just sleep through it anymore. She gasped, blinking awake. The rage of the headache and the lump on the back of her head so powerful that she couldn't see anything clearly for a moment. Her wrists were tied behind her back and she was lying on a concrete floor. She tested the bindings and found that it was rope, not handcuffs. The cold concrete beneath her cheek wasn't helping her headache. She inched herself back to the nearest wall and propped herself up against it, trying to keep her eyes clear of tears so she could look around the room. It was an empty room. No windows and only one door with a tiny hole and bars. Across it, there was a drain embedded in the floor, stained with what she assumed was blood. Claw marks were visible in the walls here and there, so this was probably where they kept shifters until they killed them. They didn't all go the way Mr. Stanley had, or Esther Fisher. She wondered if they'd fought back hard enough that the hunters hadn't bothered to bring them to this room, just done it right there and then. Amanda hated them fiercely. As she thought that, she heard movement outside the door. There was a sound of keys and a heavy metal bar scraping as it lifted, and then the door opened. Rufus looked down at her, his expression grim. You're awake. Amanda sneered at him. Yeah, but you can knock me out again and kill me if that's easier. Rufus arched an eyebrow at her. Not here to kill you. Not that I don't want to. The feeling's mutual, asshole. Rufus sank into a crouch in the doorway, looking at her eye to eye across the room, his arms settled on his thighs. I wanted to kill you the minute you showed up on my doorstep. Amanda's throat tightened out of pure rage, and she wondered if Jake had felt something similar when he was snapping his jaws. So you said, but you didn't. You killed your own man instead. And now I got a few more friends, Rufus said. Called a couple of my best Guys to come help me take care of you and your partner. Amanda blinked. What? Rufus bared his teeth at her in a gruesome smile. Oh, that's right, you were unconscious. Sorry, I must have forgot to tell you. Yeah, he's still alive. Somewhere. Amanda's heart swelled to bursting. You didn't kill him. Nah, but we shot him. We went out this morning to look for the body, but there wasn't one. Some blood and a trail, looks like he dragged himself some distance, and we know what direction to. But we're not gonna go after him. No, ma'am. Why not? Well, sugar, Rufus chuckled, squinting at her. Isn't it obvious? The impending relief in Amanda's heart popped like a balloon. She stared at Rufus and felt her veins ice over with realization. Of course they weren't going out to hunt Jake down on the mountain in the forest on his turf and terms. They didn't have to. Rufus nodded. Now you're getting it. You're using me as bait. That we are. So you'll stay nice and trussed up down here until he comes. Callan. And then we'll kill you. And if you're well behaved, maybe we won't make you watch while we skin him for a coat. Amanda felt a fresh surge of tears glisten into her eyes, but she fought to keep them back. She didn't want to cry in front of this prick. Jake was alive. She held that truth in her heart and urged it to give herself strength. She would not let these people use her as bait to trap and kill him. She was going to get out of here. She knew Jake wasn't stupid. He would see through their plan and know what they were doing. If he was hurt, he wouldn't be reckless enough to try and take on an entire house of hunters on his own. Fuck you, she muttered at Rufus and looked away. She needed to think. There had to be a way out of this dungeon, out of the house itself. These people weren't geniuses. She just had to figure out which of them was the dumbest and work out a way to exploit that. No thanks, Rufus replied. I don't bait and date. Someone will bring some food. Eventually. Sit tight. He straightened back up to his full height and grabbed the door, swinging it shut at his back. The locks bolted into place, and Amanda exhaled a breath before tilting her head back against the wall, trying to focus. First things first, the ropes binding her wrists had to go. Her arms were already sore from having them wrenched behind her back, and she'd need her hands if she was going to get physical with any of these guys. Jake was alive. Amanda could think practically, could work through the problem, because Jake was alive and her heart was no longer a shriveled, broken thing. There was hope they had another chance, and Amanda wasn't going to let him blow it trying to save her and getting himself killed. Amanda was
no damsel.
She was going to get herself out of this and save them both. She shifted in her seat, putting her back to the wall, and inhaled a deep breath as she got her hands to the small of her back. Then she strained to bring them lower to the top of her butt. She got her hands under her butt, felt the ropes go taut, and then spilled sideways onto the floor and started wriggling, trying to get her ass back between her arms, to get her wrists over her back end and moving towards her front again. She'd seen people do this in movies. If she dislocated a shoulder, well, at least she'd have one working arm and maybe a hand of some use. She didn't give in, just kept fighting to get herself righted. And after what felt like hours but must have only been minutes, she managed to scoot her rear end through her arms. The ropes went slacker as her hands hit the backs of her thighs. Almost there. She lay, hugging her knees for a moment, and then drew them all the way up to her chin, successfully sliding her arms down to her ankles. And then she sat up, pulling her feet out from between the ropes, and let her arms go limp, her hands in her lap. They were still tied, but at least they weren't at her back anymore. After another minute's rest, she lifted the ropes and started trying to gnaw through them with her teeth. But she stopped, hearing the door's lock start to turn again. She dropped her hands to her lap, but saw no reasonable way to make it look like they were still tied behind her back. Hastily, she slid her feet back through her arms and spilled herself to the ground, settling with her hands pressed against her thighs instead of fully to her back again, and hoped that maybe that would be enough. The door opened and she craned her neck, looking for Rufus again. Instead, the silhouette in the doorway was much slimmer, tall and gangly and familiar. Amanda's heart leapt into her throat as she watched him step into the room, carrying a tray of food. She lay perfectly still, but knew her eyes were wide open, wide with shock, and there was nothing she could do, nothing she could even think of to say. She stared at the loafers that came to a stop right by her head, watching as Barry Sims dropped down to place the tray of food nearby. He looked back into her face and his expression was calm. I know this is a shock. Be Barry, she stammered. What? I know. Barry nodded. And I'm sure you're disappointed in me, detective. But unfortunately an ME's assistant just doesn't make that much money. And if I'm honest, it isn't the best job either. So I have this side gig that serves me quite well, actually. You're with them? Barry tilted his head a little. With? Not much of a hunter myself. But I discovered the shifters in med school, and shortly after I discovered how much people would pay for their pelts. Since then it's been kind of a roller coaster, actually. All those people, Amanda gasped. Mr. Stanley? Are they really people? Barry asked. I mean, they're only half people if we're being generous. Of course they're people. Barry shook his head. I've seen them turn. I've seen them fight. I've seen them fuck in their animal forms, Amanda. You'd be shocked, I promise. They're more animal than human, and you know what? That scares me sometimes. I can't sleep at night knowing these abominations are out there. So I like to think I do a kind of service for these infested communities. Thin the herd. Help nature sort itself out. And I make a profit in the meantime. You knew, she realized. I told you, fuck. I'm the one who told you. The station. Barry smiled and nodded. Yeah, I knew something was up with Detective Hunter. He had all the signs. I didn't know that you knew, though. That was a surprise. I'm kind of disappointed in you as well. I asked Rufus to give it to you quick if he could because I like you, but now I'm disappointed. So you knew we were coming to the mountain and you warned them about me. Amanda whispered. That's right. And I warned them about Detective Hunter and I followed him. But I didn't know for sure, and I didn't expect you'd have trusted a wolf. He frowned. You should never trust a wolf, Detective Barnes. You're a rat, she snapped. I'm not the one in the cage. Barry rose to his feet, looking her over. I see you've got your hands in front. Well, that's all right. We're going to do something about that, but I brought you some lunch so you can eat and then I'll be back with a solution. A solution? Can't have you doing anything untoward, Detective. Rufus and his friends aren't as civilized as I am, and I've been watching you for a few months. No, you're clever. He nodded to himself. Yeah, I think a sedative is the best way. Amanda started struggling to get herself up, to lunge at him while she had the chance, but Barry turned sharply and left before she'd even gotten to her hands and knees. Fuck, she gasped, looking between the door as it shut and the tray of food he'd left behind. Fuck. She'd never felt so blindsided in her life. Even when Rufus had turned on Tom, she hadn't been this surprised. Barry fucking Sims? The town's assistant, me? Amanda had thought he'd been a little too calm when everyone else was freaking out about the murders, but she thought he was a medical examiner. Maybe he's just used to gruesome med school, other jobs. Maybe he'd just seen more than they had in Prowler's Bluff. She'd always thought he was just a harmless little guy with this stupid calming tea and his big dumb glasses in the way. He smiled whenever someone walked into his basement office. Amanda felt all of her instincts evaporate as she realized how wrong she'd been. Maybe everyone she knew hid some secret monster inside their hearts. Maybe the shifters were more human than the humans. At least their monsters were more plain, more present, a thing they didn't hide, a thing they just did their best to control. Their rules worked in a brutal society full of barbaric people. Amanda was starting to think it was the humans who were most often the monsters. Chapter 32. As Jake tromped through the woods, he wondered if there was a drug he could take to dull the sound of Fred's grumbling beside him. The old trader was on his heels as they made their way from the outpost deeper into the mountain forest, and he had not shut up for at least a mile. But Jake was just grateful that he'd convinced Fred to take him up the mountain to the local pack's den at all, and for the shirt and a sturdy pair of boots from the outpost store. There wasn't time for him to go back through the woods to find where he'd stowed his clothes, badge, and gun before he'd shifted the night before. He thought he stood a better chance of succeeding in this mad errand if he could walk right into Alistair's territory instead of the pack alpha, finding him wandering in circles on the mountain. You're hurt, Fred was saying for maybe the millionth time. This won't work. Fred, Jake sighed, rubbing at his face with his hands as they walked. Look, you had your chance. We went to the house. You saw exactly what I did. I don't have a choice. I have no other options. And it was true. He'd let Fred convince him to track them to the house and just see what they might be up against. It was worse than Jake had expected. They'd crept up as close to the hunting lodge as they dared, and there were twice as many cars than had been parked there the night before. They'd called their friends. He could smell Amanda, could smell her being carried right into that house, but now there were way too many hunters between her and Jake. Not only that, but Jake caught a second familiar scent, and then he'd known who their betrayer was. It had taken him a moment, but then he'd recognized that Weasley scent and the mixture of sweat and geek and calming tea. Barry Sims. He'd wanted to go charging into the house right then to rip out his throat, but Fred had managed to calm him. And now here he was, and Alistair was his only option. With the strength of the pack at his disposal, he could save Amanda. Without it, he was going to try anyway and probably die in the process. As far as he was concerned, it was pretty basic choice. Alistair has been Pack Alpha for more than a decade, Fred was saying. And he won it in a fight with his own father, whom he killed. Jake, these wolves are serious about this shit. He's going to kill you if you challenge him. Jake bared his teeth at Fred. All wolves are serious about this shit, Fred. Know what a dominance challenge is and how they go down. I fought them before. While already bleeding? Jake growled. There are only two ways this will go. Yeah, Fred jumped in. Either you win or you die. Either you kill Alistair or he kills you. Those are the two ways this'll go. No, Jake looked at the old traitor. Either I win and the pack attacks the house and rescues Amanda, or I lose and Alistair knows where the hunters are, and the pack attacks the house. They're not going to kill her. Either way, someone will get her out of there, which is a win-win scenario for me. Fred shut up for a while, and Jake was glad of it. He wasn't running into this fight half-cocked. He'd thought through all of it at least half a dozen times before they'd set out from Jacobson's outpost and up the mountain. He didn't think they'd let Amanda be collateral damage. Alistair seemed to have more respect for her than that. If Jake died, it wouldn't be the justice that Amanda wanted, but hopefully they'd get there in time and she'd live. That was all Jake really wanted, all he had left room for in his heart. Amanda needed to live. The pack's den was over a thickly wooded crest, a network of caves built into the mountain rock itself, just beside a quietly trickling creek that wound all the way down the mountain. They made it to the base of the hill that led to that high ridge, and then both Fred and Jake stopped in their tracks, aware abruptly that they were surrounded. Fred threw his hands in the air, but Jake didn't, knowing that he needed to dominate the situation or he'd die too. Quickly, wolves emerged from the underbrush and around tree trunks, and at the top of the ridge, Jake saw Alistair in his manskin, alongside several of the other pack shifters standing looking down at them. Sunlight illuminated them, dappling the forest floor all around them, and Alistair met Jake's eyes, his one sharp eyebrow arching slightly when Jake didn't lift his hands in a similar state of surrender. Bring them in, Alistair called, and then turned away from the ridge's edge. The other wolves led Fred and Jake up the sharp slope. Jake was impressed to see Fred take the steep, unforgiving climb up the ridge in such strides, though even Jake lost his footing here and there. It was a natural defense, the ridge, and a good one. At the top they could look down into a small valley where the mouth of a cave opened up to the creek, a perfect fresh water source. It was no wonder they defended this home so violently. As far as Jake was concerned, it was a pretty perfect place to live for a wolf pack. Better than any city. They could be wild here. Alistair was waiting for them by the creek, seated on a fallen log that they must have dragged up to the cave. Now it was more of a bench, and there was a fire pit nearby as well. A pack meeting place. Alistair watched them approach, but didn't get up from his seat. Fred was some sort of shifter, though Jake didn't know what, but he still kept his hands in the air the entire way. Jake just kept his in his pockets, his posture as neutral as he could make it, though erring on the side of offensive, never defensive. You're bold to come here, Alistair said, when they were within earshot. I have some news, Jake replied. There was a body in the woods last night, Alistair said. I expect your news is that you killed the hunter responsible for the deaths of my pack members. No, that's not my news. A rumble went through the gathered wolves and shifters, and Alistair scowled and got to his feet. You're on dangerous ground, Jake Hunter. Don't I know it, Jake sighed. And you smell of blood. That's my own blood. He nodded to Fred. He'll confirm it. I was shot last night. It's true, I patched him up, Fred said. Then who was the body in the woods? Alistair asked. That was one of the hunters. Jake pulled his hands from his pockets. He looked around at the gathered pack, made sure he made eye contact with as many of them as he could as he spoke. There are at least 6 more at a hunting lodge in the woods. Fred has the exact location written down. They shot me and kidnapped Amanda, and now they're using her as bait. They need to be punished for what they've done, and I can't do it alone. Then he looked at Alistair, and the pack alpha's eyes widened. Don't you dare. I challenge you for dominance, Jake said. I challenge you as alpha of this pack. Alistair growled at him and bared his teeth. Don't be a fool. You can't challenge me. I just did. Jake stood his ground, and the whole pack saw me do it. You won't win, Alistair pointed out. You're hurt, and I'm older and stronger. I've been alpha of this pack longer than anyone. You can't have it. Fight me and we'll see. It won't be a fight, Alistair seethed. I'll slaughter you. But the pack had already formed a circle around them, and one of the wolves had backed Fred out of it. The rules of the pack were clear enough, and Jake's challenge had been heard no matter what Alistair said in reply. Jake looked back at the pack alpha and tried not to think about anything but Amanda. He thought of her, and not what was about to happen, and he hoped that the pack had heard him, that Alistair understood that this wasn't really a challenge for dominance, just a last possible hope for salvation. He pulled his shirt off over his head and let it drop to the ground. So slaughter me, he said to Alistair. I have nothing to live for without her. What madness is that? Alistair snapped. She's a human. It doesn't matter, Jake said. She's mine. I love her. If you've ever loved anything or anyone, then you'll understand. I have to do this. Alistair was quiet a moment, looking back at him. Jake wasn't sure what he saw in the other wolf's eyes, and he tried not to wonder. Instead he thought of Amanda, thought of her face, her eyes, her mouth. He thought of the way her hair sometimes fell into her left eye, and thought of her laugh, even the derisive snicker that she'd shot his way on so many occasions. He thought of the way she arched her back when he touched her just right, of how she said his name when she wasn't pissed at him. He thought of the moment he'd told her he loved her, and he did not regret it. Crazy or impassioned or too soon, he didn't regret that. He did love her. She'd given him back the feeling of what a home was like. Nothing he saw in Alistair's face could make his courage fail as long as he remembered that. Jake and Alistair began to circle each other slowly. Alistair removed his shirt as well, but he didn't shift, not yet. They held each other's eyes as they circled, and Jake sank a little in the knees, preparing himself in case Alistair lunged and shifted for the attack at the same time. I understand what you're doing, Alistair said quietly. Good. And I appreciate that you understand our ways. I know what you're up against. I don't want to steal your pack, man, but I need you to save Amanda. Alistair laughed darkly. Don't want the pack, but you challenge me all the same. Selfish prick. I'm het. I won't win. Alistair snarled. And you think that makes it better? For you. Yes. Yes, very respectable. An alpha willing to slaughter a wounded dog. And for what? To prove a point? You're backing me into a corner. You backed yourself into a corner when you wouldn't work with us, Jake said. You took away every choice I might have had, and every choice you might have had when you refused to help outright. You packless fool, Alistair snapped. Not for long, Jake replied. And then, tired of the waiting and the circling and the arguing, and certain he already knew the outcome of this fight, Jake lunged at Alistair. Chapter 33. Amanda had done her best to shake off the shock of Barry's appearance. She sat up after a while and pulled the tray of food closer so she could eat. Of course they hadn't given her any utensils, not even a plastic knife to file away at the ropes with. Just some bread and water, an apple, and a freaking pudding cup. Amanda desperately wished for some coffee, but she dutifully ate what they'd given her, knowing she would need her strength. Then she sat back against the wall and waited, because Barry said he would be back, and someone would have to come get the tray eventually. She sat, going over the possibilities in her mind, for at least an hour. With no windows, she couldn't even be sure what time of day it was or how long she'd been out. She knew that she couldn't waste time, that if Jake was going To come for her he'd do it as quickly as he could, so she had to get out. First. She couldn't plan it, she had no tools for planning and no way of getting any so long as she stayed in that room. She decided she'd take the first opportunity she saw, and she'd have to make it work. That opportunity came while she was staring at the empty plate on the food tray, wondering how they expected her to go to the bathroom. Of course then. She looked at the drain, and a shudder of disgust went through her as she figured it out. When she heard the door's bolt slide open, she looked up, pressing her back against the wall, but stayed sitting on the floor with her hands in her lap. They'd expect her to rush the door. That wouldn't work. It wasn't Barry or Rufus who came into the room. She didn't know who this one was. It wasn't Bub either. Amanda was disappointed because he was bigger than Barry, but at least not as big as Rufus. Warily, the new hunter eyeballed her, and then came closer, leaning down to pick up the food tray. "You stay," he muttered at her. "Good girl." The fact that he talked to her like a dog did it for Amanda. She wasn't sure how much she wanted to hurt this guy, but when he told her to stay, she changed her mind. She was definitely cool with hurting him now. She waited until he reached for the tray. Then she reached out and grabbed it. First, pushing herself towards her feet, and brought the tray up and right into his face in the same movement, propelled by the power of her legs. The hunter's head snapped up, blood spurting out of his nose. As he choked and pinwheeled his arms, Amanda hit him with the food tray again, aiming the corner of it right at his throat. He gagged and dropped, hitting the floor. And she hit him again for good measure a few times until he was unconscious. "Stay," she spat. "Good dog." She tucked the tray under her arm and bent to pat him down, looking for an actual weapon, but of course even these dickheads weren't dumb enough to walk into her dungeon packing heat. A gun would have been just the ticket, or at least a knife so she could cut the rope still binding her wrists. But that was apparently too much to ask for from the universe, so she took the tray out from beneath her arm and gripped it in both hands, then paused in the doorway, inching one foot out before she leaned out into the corridor to look around. There were several other doors with metal bolts and tiny peepholes, but otherwise the corridor was narrow, white, and empty. No trophies here, Amanda thought to herself, no heads mounted, because in the end they'd be the heads of people, not animals. Maybe Barry Sims had trouble differentiating between the two, but Amanda did not. And Barry could harp all he wanted to about abominations in nature, but the hunters were killing and skinning these people for pelts, for money, and there were no two ways about it. That was murder. As Amanda inched her way down the corridor towards a staircase against one wall that must have led out of the basement, she looked into each of the other rooms. Cells. They were dungeon cells. To her relief, the rest of them were all empty. At the foot of the steps, Amanda could look up and see a door. Didn't look locked from where she was standing, and the hunter she'd left unconscious in her cell hadn't been wearing a keyring of any kind. So either they'd left the basement door open, or there was someone on the other side to let people in and out. She made her way slowly up the steps, careful that they didn't do much creaking as she went. At the door she grasped the knob and slowly tried to turn it. When it didn't stick, she exhaled a relieved breath and turned it all the way, then put her shoulder to the door and slowly opened it. Another corridor, but this one inside the main house towards the back near the porch door. If she could get out of the house and into the forest, she stood a decent chance of finding Jake before the hunters did, or before they found her. She could run for it, try to get off the mountain, and hope that Jake would find her trail and follow her instead of going for the house. All of that hinged on her getting out. She tried to breathe through the anxiety of the moment, tried to focus on exactly what she had to do from second to second instead of letting it all overwhelm her. Just get out of the house. Just get out of the house. She eased through the door, shutting it at her back without making a sound. Once in the corridor, she could smell spices and hear the crackle of something frying in oil. That told her which direction the kitchen was, and also that someone must have been there, because they wouldn't have left food frying. The kitchen must have been at the front of the house. Amanda marshaled up her courage, clutched at the food tray, and made a run for it across the room. She was halfway there when she heard someone shout, and knew that she'd been seen. She didn't look back, didn't want to know who or how many, just sprinted the rest of the way, skidding down that little hallway and careening through the porch door and out of the house. She burst into full sunlight on the porch and looked up at the sky. The sun was at its apex, so it must have been around noon. Amanda scrambled down the porch steps and then she hesitated, looking out at the thick forest in front of her, and then back at the house. She knew there were cars on the other side of the house, all parked in the drive. She didn't know if any of them had keys readily accessible. She hadn't had time to think about that. Now that she'd gotten out of the house, she realized that she should have focused a little wider on this escape. Then she heard the porch door open and knew she didn't have time to run to the cars and try to find keys. So she took off from the bottom of the porch steps and just hurried into the forest, ducking branches and zagging between trees, grasping at trunks and tripping over roots. She should have been trying to figure out where she was, what direction she should have been going in, but she could hear people behind her, hear them shout and stomp down off the porch, and all she could manage was to run. So she ran as hard and as fast as she'd ever run in her life, blindly and with no thought at all except that everything she touched would carry a scent for Jake to find. She heard gunfire at her back, and couldn't tell if they were actually firing at her or just to let each other know that they'd found their prey. She only heard the one shot and no answering shots, and her brain couldn't pause to parse it out just then. Even if they were shooting at her, they couldn't have been shooting to kill, not while she was in the woods where Jake could catch the scent of her blood. They want to take her alive again, and that gave Amanda courage, so she kept running. Then one of the hunters caught up to her. He grabbed her by the back of the shirt, then ran right into her, slamming her sidelong. She stumbled and lost her balance, pitching towards the ground, landing in the dirt and the leaves before rolling. There were hands on her again, and she lifted her head enough to see that it was Bub. She kicked him in the face, and his nose beneath her boot heel made a crunching noise that was at once sickening and satisfying. A broken nose was far less than he deserved. He howled but grabbed at her again, and Amanda dug her elbows into the dirt and tried to haul herself back even as he got his hands on her legs. He squinted at her through the blood splattering his face from his nose, his teeth bared in fury. "Get back here, bitch," he hissed. She clasped her bound hands together, interwove her fingers, and took a wide swing with both hands right for his face. Her knuckles slammed into his jaw, and he grunted, his head snapping to one side. His fingers loosened just enough on her legs that she could snake them back, kicking as she tried to crawl far enough away from him that she could get to her hands and knees and stagger towards her feet. Bub lifted his gun and shot into the air, and Amanda heard a chorus of answering shots ring out through the trees. "Over here!" Bub shouted. "She's over here. Hurry up!" Amanda heard shouts of reply, and Bub started after her again even as she made back to her feet. Lungs burning, muscles screaming, and her hands still tied, Amanda took off again between the trees with Bub and the other hunters right on her. Chapter 34. Jake hit the ground in the fighting circle, a furious growl caught in his throat, but the greater struggle was in his wolf. Alistair had already wound him up good. His first lunge had gotten him a crack across the jaw and a knee in his wounded midsection. Now he was on the ground, and his wolf wanted to take over, to shift and fight for real, but Jake fought it. Though his every instinct told him to do it, to fight to kill, Jake fought it, keeping himself in his man's skin and taking the beating. He didn't really want to have to kill Alistair, and he knew that in the end. Alistair was a better alpha than Jake could ever hope to be. Even if he died like this, they would still save Amanda, and he used that to keep himself from turning. Alistair himself hadn't shifted yet, and Jake knew if he did it would be over. So even as blackness began to creep in on his vision, his chest on fire from the inside out, he fought back the wolf. Alistair bent down, leaning over him. "I can see you fighting it," he growled. "I can feel it. How has a human woman defeated the heart of a wolf?" "She didn't defeat anything," Jake gasped. "She just helped the man be stronger. But you're a lone wolf. You'll never be happy in a pack, never be accepted." Alistair said. "She accepted me. She isn't one of us. She's mine. I'm hers. That's all that matters." Alistair ground his heel down on Jake's windpipe, and Jake felt tears of pain springing into his eyes, but he didn't shift. He wouldn't shift. This was the end, then so be it. He was prepared to die for Amanda. He closed his eyes against the pain, locked the wolf tightly up in his heart, and thought only of her. And then the pain stopped. He wasn't sure at first, thought maybe he was imagining it. In an instant it was gone, and Jake hauled in a trembling, gasping breath as he opened his eyes. Alistair was standing above him, arms folded, glaring down at him. But he'd taken his foot away. He was just standing there watching Jake come back to his senses. His wolf, Jake realized with some surprise, was silent. Suddenly Fred appeared above him as well, looking down at him with wide, worried eyes. Is he dead?
No, Alistair muttered.
I've spared him. Jake heard a murmur run through the gathered pack. He lifted his head. The bandage around his midsection was soaked practically all the way through with blood, and he had a screaming headache, but every breath he took was revitalizing. Can you do that? Fred asked Alistair. The pack alpha glared at him, and Fred actually took a step back. Of course I can, Alistair said. It's my pack. I make the rules. He looked down at Jake. And you don't really want to take my place, do you? Jake shook his head a little and started to sit up. I just want your help. Alistair looked around at the rest of the pack and lifted his hands. This wolf was willing to die to get our help. I have chosen to be merciful instead of crushing him, as is my right. He is alone, and no wolf should be alone. Please help me, Jake said, struggling towards his feet. Fred caught his arm and helped him get up. Alistair looked at him, expression hard. You want us to attack these hunters and not kill them? Jake nodded. Amanda wants to arrest them to make sure a stop gets put to all of this hunting and pelt selling business. If they're dead, we have no leads. Alistair nodded. Fine. We'll help you. But if any one of them kills a member of this pack, we will kill all of them, and you as retribution. And your humans' justice be damned. All right. It wasn't perfect, but Jake knew it was the best he was going to get. He leaned a little more heavily on Fred than he wanted to, but he'd definitely just gotten his ass kicked after having just gotten his ass kicked, and he was feeling it. They discussed a proper plan of attack. It would be that night, because even with night vision goggles, the wolves were better in the dark than the hunters. They would surround the house, find a way to draw at least one of the hunters out, and learn where they were keeping Amanda. In the midst of their planning, however, they heard the gunshots. Jake's heart constricted because he already knew. She's trying to escape, he said, letting go of Fred and hurrying towards the ridge. We have to go now. Chapter 35. Amanda couldn't run anymore. Her legs were giving out. She'd lost Bub somewhere in the trees, but she could still hear all of them tromping around in the forest, hunting for her. And she knew they'd find her. She didn't know where she was or even which way to go except away. All her police training, all the childhood afternoons spent hunting on the mountain with Captain Martin, all of that experience fled her mind. She was being hunted like an animal, and all she could do was run, but even that was getting harder. She wasn't going to get much further before she had to stop. Her body would give up well before her heart did. Her knees buckled and she hit the ground, crawling until she could put her back to a tree. She gulped down breaths and closed her eyes, listening to the hunters in the distance. She knew they were getting closer, but every inch of her hurt and her strength was practically spent. She couldn't even wrap her arms around herself because her hands were still tied at the wrists. Realizing that, she twisted a little and tried to find a rough patch of bark she might use to work through the rope. As soon as she turned, though, she found herself staring up the barrel of a rifle and right into Rufus' face. He smiled. Gotcha. Amanda froze, looking up at him. She thought about trying to grab the rifle, but her arms were exhausted and he was twice her size. She thought about trying to make a run for it, but her legs were exhausted and he had a longer stride. It was over. She had nowhere to go and no flight left in her limbs. Her heart sank and broke, and hope shattered as she looked up at Rufus and felt herself give in. But then she heard the growling. So did Rufus. The hunter whipped around and Amanda looked behind him to see a huge gray wolf emerge from a thicket of branches and leaves. Then two more wolves slinked into view, flanking him. In the distance, Amanda heard a human scream, followed by the triumphant sound of a wolf's howl. Rufus cocked his rifle and aimed it at the gray wolf. I don't know what the fuck is happening right now, but I'll shoot every last one of you damned monsters and skin you with my bare hands. Amanda took the opportunity his turned back provided, lashing out with one foot. She kicked him right in the back of the knee and Rufus dropped. His rifle swung upward, a shot ringing out as he hit the ground on one knee. Fumbling with the gun, Amanda shoved herself away from the tree and dove, slamming into Rufus and grabbing the rifle right out of his hands as he pitched forward, sliding through the dirt on his elbows. Amanda planted the rifles butt on the ground and pushed herself up to her feet, then lifted the rifle and aimed it right at Rufus' face as he looked up at her. He froze on his hands and knees and scowled. But the scowl fell right off his face as the wolves closed in around him, the large gray wolf at the fore, snarling and jaws snapping. "I should let them eat you," Amanda murmured, staring at him down the length of the rifle's barrel. She took a moment to revel in their reversed positions. Rufus glared up at her. "But will you?" Amanda glared back at him and let him stew in wondering if she'd let the wolves rip him to shreds. Ultimately, she shook her head a little and looked at the big gray wolf, who had stopped barely a foot away from Rufus, actively eyeballing the hunter's throat. "Stop," she said to the wolves. "I know you want to kill him, but you can't. I'm going to arrest him." The gray wolf snarled again. "Alistair, please." The gray wolf looked up at her, and after another few seconds the snarling stopped and he snapped his jaws and then backed up. The other wolves followed suit and Amanda looked back to Rufus. "Very good of you," Rufus muttered. "On your feet," Amanda snapped, keeping the rifle leveled at his face. "Come on. Alistair, where's Jake?" The alpha wolf's ears twitched and then he turned, prowling into the woods, with the other wolves back in what Amanda assumed was the direction of the house. She waved the rifle after them, as Rufus struggled up to his feet. He looked after the wolves and then started limping along behind them, and Amanda followed with the rifle up the entire time. "There's no way they overpowered my friends," Rufus said as they walked. "I think you're underestimating these wolves," Amanda replied. "They're still animals." "But they're not, you bigoted prick," Amanda snapped. "Are you people that stupid? They're not just animals. They're also people, and you've been murdering them." Rufus sneered at her. "If you had any balls at all, detective, you just kill me yourself." Again she wanted to just shoot him with the rifle. But she didn't really. Was a good fantasy, a satisfying fantasy, ridding the world of another awful person. But it wasn't real, and Amanda was not a killer. In the end, that's what separated her from these people, she told herself. They broke in the law. Not just the laws of the land but the laws of mankind, and justice wasn't served by killing killers. She wanted to see Rufus locked up for the rest of his life, packed away in a cell instead of out in the wilderness he exploited. Death was an easy way out for these assholes. She nudged him with the rifles nozzle and smiled at him when he looked at her again, his expression grim. "Not gonna happen, Rufus." They tromped back through the forest, following the wolves towards the Hunter's Mountain Lodge, its tall chimney poking up through the trees. Amanda's heart started to pound and she struggled with keeping an eye on Rufus back and looking around between the trees trying to find Jake. She just needed to see that he was alive. Of course she wasn't sure what form he was in, but she knew that when she saw him, whether the man or the huge black wolf, she'd know him immediately. Her whole body was practically humming with longing, with excitement, with need. Those few hours when she'd thought he was dead were probably the worst hours of her entire life. In the back of her mind, she knew she'd have to find handcuffs or something and pack up all the hunters somewhere while she called the station to have Captain Martin send a bus to get them. She knew she'd have to deal with telling him about Barry Sims. But none of that could really pierce through how badly she needed to lay eyes on Jake.